informational space. And that goes to the inside, whereas when they're congregated, they could be used on the outside, because we also were dealing with the notion of, since relating to the capitalistic concept, of how market drives this, drive these things, and these living pods, if you could consider architecture, they're not, they could be related to consumer products like things like cars or iPods, etc. That's why I put the brands on them. And well, that's basically.
In what way are they like cars? Because they're prefabricated.
Yeah, because you could choose what car or what product to build, and you could go aftermarket and add it.
Do people own these?
Yeah, that question was also raised, of people owning them or they being rented by a public authority.
I think the spirit of Coney Island is more rental. You know, it's something you rent. This is not suddenly going to become a kind of East Hampton Beach resort. I think it's people coming there temporarily. So it's about the capitalistic dimension is you rent the thing and then you give it back or you turn it over to the next renter. You know, again, your project is quite thorough, but there are certain aspects of it that seem kind of retro. You know, I mean, I think one of them is the idea of a kind of crawling bug, or something that has the kind of appearance of this, what do they call them? Arthropods or arthropods? Yeah, whatever that term was. Tracing back to your professor, Peter Cook, and his colleague. But I wonder, you know, here it's about vocabulary. We talked about vocabulary before. You know, on the one hand, you have the extreme kind of bug-like carapace or spinal column structure of the shell, and then you have these kind of mechanical legs which look like Bucky Fuller pieces. So you have kind of the marriage of the mechanical and the biological. I wonder, I mean, I'm just looking to the next step in a project like this. How else they might look if the same concept were applied. That they weren't so literal, that they weren't so illustrative of the mechanical and the biological, or the organic in this case. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I think it takes it up to a threshold. I'm convinced you have an idea, and you've carried it through visually. You know, we were criticizing other projects very strongly, but I kind of said, oh, wait a minute, you know, I've seen this before. How else could this be developed? And I'm just saying, for the next step, okay? We're still at midterm here, all right? A brilliant midterm.
You're following on from there, but I mean, some parts of the story are not so clear yet, and if you would clear them up, then that would create another set of opportunities for design. And it seems to me like you obviously have the ability to design how
Absolutely.
Any direction, any change of direction. So I mean, it seems to be striking that the people inside your insects are asleep, and you put a lot of emphasis on virtual reality, which would normally invite the jury to say, well, if you're asleep and totally in a cocoon of information, why are you at the beach? I think there has to be this sort of explanation of what that might be, and that might suggest that you need a story about the relationship between the sleeping person and the insect. Yeah, I mean, in the kind of matrix view of things, you're asleep because it's important that you don't know what the bug is doing, even if you're bug that you're in. In another fantasy, the bug doesn't even know you're in there. Right? So you're actually sort of a parasite. So it just happens to be that bugs carry out a particular function, and it's been discovered that actually you can rely around on them, and because of the incredible computing power they need in order to continually scavenge and rebuild the environment, it turns out that a rather small amount of that information would be an entire entertainment system for a person, but one still doesn't know what that is. And am I asleep in there because I sold my soul and my family and my house to the bank? Like, did I say that you can use every piece of energy that's associated with me? I'll give you all the energy associated with me. I just need a very thin, gauzy layer of fabric. So you lie back.
And an opium dance,
right?
Where you go in and just go into a dream.
Right. And in return for that, I want to not really know what the world is going on. And another name for that is an American suburban house.
Yeah.
Right? In which people are essentially asleep, watching extraordinarily sophisticated information systems that are so sophisticated that they can even look at a war that they're waging as if it's being waged by someone else and not be either horrified at the effect of that war or at their own carrying out of that war. So you can also say this is a sort of image of contemporary society, and that you are therefore that all this could be read as little worker ants constructing a beautiful house for the is it the Queen Ant?
Yeah.
One with the red dot for the Queen. So it's also noble activity. I mean, until that Woody Allen movie, nobody ever had the idea of sort of neurotic ant, or a misbehaving ant, or a villainous ant. They're all like virtuous citizens. They're all like idiots, basically.
Yeah.
That pass information to each other by touching. The ant works like a brain by touching. Right? So you could say, oh, no, don't misunderstand me. This is not like beautiful little worker ants building a war of the future. This is actually what's left of the environment being scavenged by these insects, and the very act of scavenging is creating energy and providing nourishment and comfort to a citizen that no longer wants to face the consequences of that, so much so that they can be at the beach and not want to swim. And if you follow that line, then you make some design changes, like the overall shape of the cocoon is the same, whether it be in the zone that would be the virtual reality part, or whether it be the piece at the back. And one is from a technical point of view. Why would the rear end of the insect have the same essential texture and so on as the virtual reality end? And if there is some relationship between input and output, between receiving information and acting on the world and virtual reality, there might be every reason to imagine a continuity, but also an architectural detail. Maybe it folds out, that maybe the information screen on the inside becomes a receiver on the outside, and you put a few wires in there. And just start to work.
You know, the thing that's interesting here that this begins to get into is the whole question of form. Because if you're in this virtual world, you could be in a container. Why do you need to be in an exotic form? Why do you need? I know. I'm just saying.
No, you know what I was thinking, Lebbeus, when he says virtual, he says.
Why?
That's the name of his head.
Why not just a cube?
Well, basically because the client is me. So that's why in the beginning I said.
I like your answer.
Yeah, that's why in the beginning I said it was consumer product, because I could be
So this
carrying
is more
machines
sexy.
and decide
This
whatever.
is sexier,
Yeah.
the shape.
Yeah.
Okay.
Totally.
But you know what? If you're the manufacturer and you're the guy marketing these things,
Yeah.
you talk about capitalistic symbiosis.
Yeah.
You're going to look to the bottom line and you're going to say, it's a little expensive to produce. We're going to make this a cube and people won't even know the difference.
You're right.
Now, okay, it's not a critique of what you did, it's more a discourse about the subjects you raised.
Well, basically it's I chose to do whatever I wanted design-wise.
Yeah.
Basically because sometimes I feel people are hiding behind diagrams, not taking responsibility for what they design.
I love what you've done. I think it's brilliant. I started off by saying that. But now you also raise interesting topics for discussion.
Yeah, but that what you just say is the wrong answer. You're missing the opportunity to build an argument. I mean, when you were presenting and you said inside the other face that, okay, that's how you're going to get crucified. And I tell you why, because when you produce, whether you like it or not, whether you acknowledge it or not, you're doing a very strong exercise in production of form that relate to a whole series of aesthetic decisions that you're making. and they have this kind of a retro look, they look mechanic, they look in a particular way. Anybody who knows anything about robotics today,
Yeah.
robots don't look like robots anymore. They look like anything else but machines. So the argument is you're making here a very image-driven aesthetic argument that has to do with many of the issues that you're raising. In my view, from the work, the interior part of the virtual environment, whatever, is the less relevant and the less interesting about your project. Because if that's the case, you only show one interior shot of the whole thing. So that for me is clear that it wasn't in the center of your argument. The center of your argument has to do with the assembly of parts with a very specific different formal vocabulary, which for me that's interesting, how you relate those kind of a more Cartesian structural system with a kind of more free-form pod that they crawl like insects and so on. So there's all these other things on the table. And you put it, they have to do much more. You're treating this way more as an object than you're treating it as an environment, virtual interior, blah, blah, blah. So I think that's the part that when you say, I want to say whatever I want, that's fine, but I think you're missing the opportunity to articulate because I think you're producing something that's more sophisticated. There are certain decisions that they are not made in an arbitrary way. So the way that you, also I appreciated when you present the work, I think it was interesting, but today probably because I didn't have lunch, I'm going to keep talking about food. You cannot just come and present and say food is energy for the body, because a burger at McDonald's will do. But if you want to pay $200 for a dish, the chef is making an argument on way more sophisticated how to put ingredients, and going different things. It will reveal a whole series of flavors that you didn't know that exist. And I think what you have here is a high cuisine thing. You don't have a burger. Yeah. And you're reducing the argument, like you say, no, it's just that. And I said, I could be absolutely wrong, but I think any project that addresses a condition of form and in a way affect or virtual and so on, you need to make a case about what that means in terms of aesthetic, what that means in terms of the reaction that you're trying to produce in the audience, even if the audience is yourself. That's a given. Because I think the work and the narrative, I think the narrative is, in terms of as selling as a product, is an interesting one. I would like to hear a little bit more of the expertise of what you bring as a designer. Because the argument that you're doing is too much the guy who will do the marketing campaign for this, which is part of what you're doing, but at the same time, you're not doing something generic, you're doing something which is super specific. And I think it's something that you should be talking about because that's what adds value to your what the work that you've done. That's the contribution that you bring into the table. And again, I agree with Lebbeus. I appreciate the project a lot. I think the project is interesting, but I think have all these retro science fiction feel from the 50s and 60s embedded within. Then I think it's, which I think is a clever way because I think it's a way to communicate the whole series of emerging formal languages. And you combine it with this cable system and make it a little more retro and allow them to produce a different kind of dialogue.
But I think the science fiction thing is good, as long as we know what the story is.
Yeah.
Like, it would bother me, the fact that it goes back, that it's retro. I mean, actually, almost every image of the future is retro. It's all about, like, you know, Brazil is all about, you know, 19th century, and it's always that.
Yeah, many of the moves I did were based on this book, Neuromancer by William Gibson. Right. Where they present a futuristic environment, but it's very run down. Just because at the beginning I wasn't feeling I was relating to Coney Island.
Yeah, but just sorry to interrupt, but for us, like whatever architects, that species, the retro is not retro for other disciplines. Retro for you would be what's left to be more science fiction and Peter and Mike Webb's Levius's were. What about Constant, right? He imagines a city of the future, a city in which nobody ever works, so they're going to just lie around like this, in which it'll be a city of desire, and the one big problem with his scheme, which will be endlessly rebuilt by design, but what he never explains is how it will be rebuilt. There's a secret community of technicians who are going to do it, but how do you know what the desires are, and how do you negotiate? And I thought, not by chance, these things look like brains on legs, and that in the end, the implication of this is that while you sleep, the insect will, as it were, rebuild the landscape according to your desires in competition with other brains, other sleeping humans. And the way it deals with existing landscapes is quite savage. I mean, it's quite like those images of oil tankers being dismantled and ripped apart. I mean, it has a sort of echo, and in that sense, it's not a kind of necessarily positive scenario, and nor should be. In the case of Constant, it ends up with basically the people who don't have to work anymore and can satisfy every desire killing each other. So the last image is from 71 to 74, just endless blood, this project covered with blood. And I do think one, particularly in the context of the brilliant brief that Peter gave you, one has to sort of, as it were, return to some level, what's the relationship between that science fiction and the fantasies that have always been dominant at Coney Island? Like, how does this fit into that?
I want to come up to the shelf here because this is clearly a student who is a joy to tutor. I don't think this is the issue. I mean, I just listen to what he's got to say and say, hey, that sounds really interesting. but I was very trepidatious about this presentation in a jury because it does have a certain degree of virtuosity as a piece of design. I mean, it comes right from my world, not so much in the possession of pods, but he's a real old architect. He likes putting stuff together, and he knows mostly about what he's putting together. That's pretty unusual in these days. But therefore, I'm nervous because there will be a sort of irritation factor on the part of perhaps his peer group, on the part of teachers, or even people like me would say, oh fuck, the guy can do it. Let's try and catch him up. Right? Well, that's a Barcelona. Me, but also, I think I, like everybody else, am also, when you get a good student, you're looking at the bit where he might have faltered, because then it gives you the chance of moving in there. And I personally think the pods are the most boring part, partly because I must have had at least, 5,000 students who've done pods. And I've seen every student pod, and perhaps the pod is no longer needed. Maybe we've gone past pods. Like in German schools of architecture, they should have gone past a sort of 4-person family house, although it seems to be sticking around. Yeah. But I think what's interesting is that you enjoy manipulating. You're able to manipulate, but you enjoy manipulating. And perhaps the strongest parts of the scheme are where there is still room for manipulation and where manipulation